Good morning, everyone. Thank you for staying in the room despite the intriguing sound sharing experience. And I apologize for the delay. Talking about next day scenario, day after scenario, and power sharing at this very specific moment with ongoing wars, political stalemates, and growing costs in human lives, destruction, illiteracy. Talking about this at this moment seems like a naive or maybe an unavoidable, overly optimistic approach. Looking at Lebanon, which 3 decades after the end of its civil war is still operating on a thin balance of power, often involving limited cycles of violence, could be very interesting. I'm going to be discussing these topics a little bit with more details with my panel. With me today, Ms. Jamila Ali Raja, the director of Consult Yemen, a diplomat and a member of the National Dialogue, Dr. Joseph Bahout, non-resident scholar at the Middle East program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and Mr. Assaad Al-Achi, the executive director of Baytna Syria. Thank you for being with me. Ms. Jamila, I want to start with you. Despite the weakness of the Stockholm peace dialogue, a lot of people seem or want to believe that this could be a good start for a peace process in Yemen. Would you please give us generally your thoughts and whether you think talking about the day after and power sharing in Yemen?
Well, good morning all of you, and good morning to my panelists. And the situation of Yemen, I believe that the idea of power sharing is part of the culture in a traditional way, not in the model. It's not working. Voice. Oh, I should put it on. Sorry. I'm being spoiled. Okay. Very quickly, power sharing in Yemen is part of the culture, if we go back in the traditional sense, not in the new sense. In the traditional sense, we had tribal system where you cannot lead or you cannot be an autocrat. You had to share your power because you had different tribes and different ways to rule. But in the new concept of power sharing, it is different. And there are two leaders who tried to not to power share, and they did not succeed. Or two eras. The era was the Imamate era, where you did not have power sharing, and actually they took hostages of the sons of the tribal leaders to be autocratic or theocratic rule. The second one was during Ibrahim al-Hamdi, where he wanted to lead a reform, and he fought back on the tribes, and it did not come out in a good way. The only experience we have about power sharing came after the 2011, where we thought that we can lead a transitional period in Yemen following the uprising of the youth and the popular uprising. And we came out with 2 or 3 basic ideas that could lead into power sharing, which is a consensus government, which was a coalition of of most of the political parties in Yemen. The number 2 was the National Dialogue. For the first time, people had to accept that the idea of not only those who have guns and have the power of fighting could be part of the power sharing, which means it was, for the first time, we included women, civil society, and youth. So this was the new concept that was introduced to Yemen. And despite the fact that now we went into war again and the situation is not, but I think it is an experience that we can build on. It's a unique experience. It showed people that they cannot, not only one party can rule Yemen, but still now we're in a dilemma, as Alia said, that we do not have, we want peace, or the political parties and the regional maybe would want peace, but they do not know how. The how is now where we're stuck in, and I think part of it is trust. We do not trust each other, and we cannot share if we do not trust. And I believe we're in a position, we're trying, where the UN and other people who are concerned for peace are trying to find a path towards that. Stockholm is still in slow steps. We know that we have the prisoners agreement maybe working forward a little bit. Hudaydah, we're still testing it with the two parties, but I believe that maybe if we try to explore different aspects of going back to the general framework for the peace in Yemen. So as I said, we are still not there. We're not still in the power sharing, but there are two things that make me a little bit apprehended, is that the two warring parties in the negotiations do not want any other factor to join the peace talks. They just want to be the only ones in peace. They say during stopping the war does not mean that you should be included, and I think that's a big mistake. That's where everybody should be included. But let's see, if they finish the stopping the war and then they go into the peace plan, maybe other parties could be included, and sharing the power could be a part of it. I still believe, again, that people on the ground are the ones who dominate. If I'm on the table, if I'm going to be part of the decision making, if I'm going to have a say in the future and to continue or not, but there is a slight change where I have to, and the others, the UN, the people have to work on and empower it. And I think that's going to be, Alia, the challenge, and I hope we reach that point.
Actually, I would like to go back in a bit to the details of who the other parties involved would be. But before we go too far, I want to take it to Mr. Al-Achi. Here we have a situation where the two parties are starting to build a trust process. Maybe they would succeed, maybe they won't. But in the case of Syria, it looks like we have an obvious winner. The problem is the concept of power sharing seems to be irrelevant. Or probably possible to achieve. We were just talking that there's a huge part of the Syrian society is now outside the country, and it seems like any future deal will not involve them. How would you put that in a general framework in the case of Syria?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. There are two things that makes me laugh when we talk about Syria: power sharing and the day after. The day after what exactly? The day after Daesh? The day after Assad? Does it even exist? The day after what exactly when we talk about the case of Syria? The second thing is power sharing. Power sharing with whom? And even if we don't have a winner, even if we hadn't had a winner, who are you sharing power amongst? The situation is not very monolithical, and the way to look at it, I guess, has to be nuanced. If we go a bit into the history of the country, I'm not going to go into details, but at least for the last 40 years, although the regime, the current regime in Damascus seems to be very, a unique model, or a very centric model, it constitutes some form of cooptation, at least, maybe not necessarily a power sharing model, but a cooptation model of other forces of society, mainly the socio-economic elites of the big cities, Damascus, Aleppo, Homs, so on and so forth. And when we look at those socio-economic elites and how they've behaved in the past 6 or 7 years, although they didn't start at the beginning of the uprising in Syria, they were not that much aligned with the current regime. Over time, their position has crystallized in support of the current power structure in Damascus. So it's really hard to talk about any form of power sharing at the moment in Damascus. But I don't think the war is over in Syria, and this expectation that the conflict is over is not necessarily true. We might see a cessation of hostilities. We might not see any more kinetic action, but I don't think the conflict is over at all. We're at a new stage of the conflict. So it will be interesting to look at other power sharing mechanisms that were developed elsewhere in Syria. The model that comes to mind is probably the model that currently exists in the northeast of the country, and the power sharing model that the Syrian Democratic Forces and through the Syrian Democratic Council have developed. It's equally authoritarian as the model in Damascus. I'm not trying to say that it's democratic in any mean, but it had tried to develop some form of power sharing along ethnic lines between Arabs and Kurds, and on a gender balance, create a gender balance as well, where when you look at the different structures under the SDC, you always have these co-presidencies between a man and a woman, which is new as well to the area. So there are some models that are being.
But do you see any possibility of
this extending beyond the northeast of the country? No, okay. At least not at the moment. What scares me the most, though, and I'll stop here, is the last speech of Bashar al-Assad, where he started talking about a bottom-up approach to Syria and started discussing the role of local councils, etc. The reason it scares me is it's an indication of the mentality in Damascus, which is a mentality of total control. So we're moving away from whatever model existed even pre-2011 to more of a North Korean model, where you have a complete control of everything, including the small mahalla and the small city or the small village in the neighborhood of Suwaida or Daraa or Kamishli or whatever it is. And we are starting to see signs of this. If anyone followed the municipal elections that happened in September of last year in Syria, it was scary the way the Ba'ath Party approached them. Usually what the Ba'ath Party does is they don't go with closed lists to these municipal elections. They always leave 2 to 3 seats for independents, etc. And that has been the practice for a while. In September of last year, that wasn't the case. They went with closed lists of party loyalists, and they won every single seat in every single locality where they actually had representatives. So we are moving away even from whatever form of opening we had before. So although local councils and power devolution from the center to the periphery and power devolution from the center to different smaller structures might be a solution for Syria, and I think it is a solution for Syria. It depends on how this power devolution is played and who is managing the whole process. If it's power devolution from the security apparatus in Damascus to the security apparatus in Idlib, we haven't achieved anything. We're actually continuing the same antagonistic behavior within the regime structure, and no representation for whatever local structure.
Yeah, I want to talk later about the realism of such a scenario, a North Korean scenario in Syria. But before we do, Dr. Bahout, we have 2 very interesting scenarios, and we have the Lebanese scenario by itself. If you look from the Lebanese perspective, where would you see similarities or differences? What can we look back 3 decades, and then some of the things are repeating themselves, some are not. How would you look at it?
Okay, thank you, Alia, and thank you for Carnegie and the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation for having this very important, I think, conference. And symbolically, it's important that it happens in Lebanon because, I mean, without any chauvinism, but Lebanon is, among all these cases, probably the ancestor of Arab cases of power sharing. So we have a kind of historical breadth and long time to be able to compare something. This leads me to my first point, my introductory remark, is that the Lebanese model, it's not exactly a Lebanese scenario, it's a Lebanese model that has a pretension, with all the meanings of the term pretension, to be a kind of blueprint for power sharing in heterogeneous societies. It's a model that has history. This is a very important point to keep in mind, and it has to do with when people talk about what are the lessons from Lebanon to be drawn for countries like Syria, Iraq, Yemen, maybe tomorrow Algeria if things unfold, and etc. The breadth of history of the Lebanese power sharing system is important because history has a meaning. History creates traditions, it creates political culture, it creates elites of a certain kind, and this has to do with the Lebanese type of power sharing. So the Lebanese type of power sharing was both, and I think what Heiko Women this morning said is important, it's both textual, it's inscribed in a constitution, but most of it, and probably the most important part of it, is not inscribed in anything. It's a verbal, quote-unquote philosophical, etc. concept. I mean, the National Pact is not written in Lebanon. There's nothing called the National Pact. If you go to any archive today, you will never find something called the National Pact. It's a verbal exchange in the parliament at one day during Shara al-Khoury and Riyad al-Sulah, and this was the National Pact. So having said that, important thing to also to remember is that this pact has two functions, and this is the second point. It's the functionality of power sharing. You don't do power sharing just for the pleasure of doing power sharing. In some societies, politics work without power sharing. For example, in Jacobin societies like the French one or the Egyptian one, or etc., you don't really need power sharing. Because in this morning, we probably confused power sharing with democracy. It's not the same thing. You can have power sharing without democracy, and you can have democracy without power sharing. Democracy is a way of devoluting power, but power sharing is a way of giving guarantees to segments of societies on the top of the guarantees or the rights you give to individuals. So it's not exactly the same. The function of power sharing in Lebanon had answered two needs. The first one was a functional need, i.e. who will occupy which position. This is the part that we talk about in Lebanon, about the president is Maronite, the prime minister is Sunni, the distribution of positions in the first category of civil service, and etc., etc. And then you had the second part of the functionalities of the National Pact, which is a quote-unquote ideological functionality. And it had to do with the inception of the country, of Lebanon. This is why also it's not maybe completely comparable to Syria and Yemen and Iraq and elsewhere. Because in Lebanon, you had a country that was created, let's agree on it, I mean, let's accept it as it is, by a hegemon at one point, which was the Christian Maronite hegemon with the help of France. And then you had to integrate a new constituency in the country. That was the Muslim constituency that has other political, let's say, ambitions or dreams that were more pan-Arab, and then you have to accommodate that. And this is, for me, the most interesting part of the National Pact, which is embodied by this famous formula of Riyad al-Sulah in this parliamentary, in this session of parliament where the National Pact was crafted, when he said, and it's inscribed in the verbatim of the Lebanese parliament, he said, our agreement is a way to Arabize the Christians of Lebanon and to Lebanonize the Muslims of Lebanon. I think this is the most interesting part of it, which is not exactly comparable to other cases in the Middle East. Now, what is comparable is that this pact that has had happy hours and very gloomy hours, it led to a war, but this is another story, we'll talk about it, because there are conditions for a consociational democracy a la Libanaise to work, and these conditions were not met. We'll talk about that. But the Taif Agreement came and tried to revamp this National Pact. However, what the Taif Agreement didn't say or didn't see or didn't want to see, because it was a willing blindness, is that the power sharing between Christians and Muslims, that was the case in 1943, was no more the case in the 90s. It was a power sharing between mainly the Shias and the Sunnis. So Lebanon post-Ta'if was a precursor of the Middle East of today. The rift between the two big Muslim communities has started in Lebanon before even unfolding in Iraq in 2003 and etc. And I think this is partly what created the fragility of Ta'if and what is creating the actual now, today's crisis in Lebanon. The second thing, and I think we'll discuss it tomorrow afternoon or tomorrow in the second session, is that the second pillar of Ta'if and the new National Pact in Lebanon was that it was strongly very strongly predicated, if not determined, on a regional protector, a regional mandatory power that was Syria. And it's written in the agreement. Taif is twofold. You have a chapter which is the devolution of power, and you have a second chapter which is Al-Alaqat Mumayyaza Bayna Lebanon wa Syria, which is part of the agreement. It's not something brought from elsewhere. And this was also a second problematic part, because part of the Lebanese life in the post-war period became a reflection, an image, and sometimes a substitution of the political life that was inexistent in Syria, meaning that the elite in Syria, the struggles within the elite in Syria, was solved in Lebanon through the Lebanese political system, which in fact created this kind of gemelity between the two systems. This is to say, and I'll conclude on that if you have to draw some lessons from Lebanon to the regional situation, I mean, be it Syria tomorrow or Iraq or Libya, how many times, Assad, have you heard that we need a Syrian Taif and etc. And the fact that Lakhdar Brahimi was the special envoy for Syria and having been the creator of the Taif agreement was not alien to that. Okay, there are certain things that you have to take from the Taif agreement that are interesting. First of all, a kind of recognition, a conceptual recognition by politicians and by analysts like us that diversity exists in this region. It doesn't mean that you have to go to a sectarian power sharing, but that you have to acknowledge diversity and heterogeneity of society. This is something very important. Then you have to accept that nationalism is not completely exclusive, and this is something that in Syria is the case with the Kurdish question and etc. And then you have the negative lessons. The negative lessons have to do with what we will probably discuss later on, but it has mainly to do with the quality of the elites. And this is something that you can't decide by a priori, because you can't create the elites you want, but a consociational democracy cannot work if the elites are not in a way cultured or formed in the mindset of sharing not only power but wealth also, because power sharing, consociational democracy has a very strong economic component without which the consociational democratic pact cannot function. And this is, I think, one of the challenges of tomorrow's Syria.
I want to stay with you a little bit and talking about functionality from its practical point of view. There is the issue of governance, and I think this is later what would apply to Yemen or Syria. There is a sense that there is a consensus over diversity in Lebanon, for example, but the fact is there is one single party that is the winner and that is imposing political agendas, etc., etc. The willingness of a stronger side to be part of a consensual political process, is that in the long term, in the case of Lebanon, we're seeing constantly that the system works, but it does not really work. We always have governments that don't, that are delayed in formation, etc., etc. So
I'm often accused of being maybe too indulgent with the Lebanese system, and I'll be there today. I think that compared to what's not working in the region, it's working. Now, it's, as I'll paraphrase one very good friend of mine, Nadim Shhadi, who says that Lebanon is the most successful of failed states in the world. So yeah, so Lebanon is a failed state, but it is functioning. I mean, at least we're here, we're gathering, we don't have huge security problems and etc. But the state is not functioning. What you are saying is this kind of confusion between the political actuality and the idea of the National Pact. You're not mentioning the name. Okay, you are saying that Hezbollah is dominating political life in the country. But when you look at it closely, Hezbollah is dominating political life, yes, but in order to make this domination work, it is sharing power. Because there are limits they cannot go beyond. It is at least the constitutional limit, and it's also the political limit. They have to agree with others and etc. The fact that they accept a national unity government with all the dysfunctionings and etc. is something to be noted. Now, what you are saying here, I think, points to something else that is, to my mind, the congenial fragility of a consociational democracy and a power-sharing formula, which is time and the evolution of demographics. I think this is the main challenge of a consociational system. Because when you fixate power sharing, you are fixating numbers. So you can say, like the Lebanese constitution or the Lebanese national agreement says, that al-munasafa, or parity between Christians and Muslims, is regardless of the distribution of the numbers. But you can't fixate that forever. At one point, there's one actor that will say, okay, I'm not anymore satisfied with the size of this suit that you have crafted at this time. I want to revise it, and I want to revise it by counting numbers. At that point, you will have to make, society, because, this is also what something was discussed this morning. Are you sharing power between the state and society or between segments of society? This is a crucial question. If there's a societal pact to share power, at that point, there will be a kind of existential question that is posed, that is put on the table. Are we willing to live together regardless of the balance of power that is fluctuating by definition, not only because demographics, but because of the regional situation? Or are we indexed on political life, which is the definition of democracy in a way, and things are bound to change constantly, and who will provide which guarantees to whom in order for a system like the Lebanese one to avoid two pitfalls: either permanent fragmentation and the regular and, in a way, quasi-sporadic civil wars. And if you look back at the history of Lebanon during the 150 years, you had a kind of civil war every 15, 20 years, okay? If you want to avoid but also wanting to avoid escaping that by jumping into systems like the Syrian and the Iraqi Ba'athi systems that are Jacobine, centrist, and etc., but liberticide, killing freedoms and etc., you have to find something in between. And this is the challenge of the Lebanese model. But having said that, it's a model that is constantly under challenge. And this is why I think, at least this is my reading of the country, and I'm sorry to accept that, but you have to accept to have a kind of not minimal state in Lebanon, but a state that has certain functions that it cannot fulfill. And this is it.
I'm going to take it back to you, Assaad. Do you think that you mentioned North Korean model in Syria? Is that realistic, you think? Like, even without the pretension of a representative regime, even if it's fake, but even without the partnership with the bourgeoisie, is this realistic in a country like Syria, and also within the context of the region?
It depends. This is definitely, at least the behavior of the regime in Damascus indicates that this is where they're heading. This is what they want. Now, whether they can get there or not depends on many factors. First factor would be the reaction of these socioeconomic elites that exist in the different cities. I'm not trying to say by any means that they're going to rebel. I don't think so. Their behavior over the past 50 to 60 years is indicative of how they've been performing under different categories of governance models. But also it depends on the regional powers, whether there's very limited Syrian agency left in the Syrian conflict. So when we talk about power sharing, we might also, in Syria, we might also want to talk about power sharing between Turkey, Iran, and Russia. And if Turkey, Iran, and Russia agrees to share power under the Astana framework or under a different framework, then that might create a power sharing model for Syria. Obviously, you still have the Kurdish issue to resolve there. And once you resolve that, you have a mechanism. So therefore, I think the strong intervention of regional countries in the Syrian conflict would not allow this to go to a North Korean model, regardless of the wishes of Damascus. But if there isn't a strong engagement with the community-based structures whether they're civil society actors or local councils or whatever forms of governance at this very small scale level. If that engagement doesn't continue and expand, the fear is the regime will come in and co-opt everything. And we've seen the regime and its sponsors do that over the past 6 years. Just look at the different armed groups and what has happened to most of these armed groups. I'm just going to give a small example what happened to the armed groups or to the Southern Front in Daraa. Most of them were co-opted within the 5th Corps that is now financed by the Russian Federation. So this is the model. This is the model that the regime is suggesting of how to create the future Syrian society based on co-optation, literally based on forced co-optation. And that will not allow for a sustainable peace in the country. Therefore, the engagement at the smaller structures, local councils, society actors, etc., at the community-based level is of quite an essence to kind of create a societal resistance to this hegemonic movement that the regime is pushing. Just look at the speech, and I'm going to go back to what Joe was talking about, the heterogeneity versus homogeneity. Look at the last speech, well, not the last speech of Bashar, so the one before, where he talked about creating a homogeneous society. This is what he has in mind. The guy is coming and telling us clear and center what his model is for the future of Syria. He wants a homogeneous society.
But do you think this is a serious roadmap for this? Like, is he serious about this?
This is his roadmap. Yes, I think it is his roadmap. And I think if we look at how he has behaved or how the regime has behaved over the past 7 years, it definitely delivered on everything it has said. It delivered. It talked about the issue of terrorism, released hundreds of terrorists, and then we had an issue of terrorism. It talked about sectarianism, and we have although the Syrian model is not necessarily a sectarian model, but we have a sectarian issue in Syria. We need to acknowledge that.
But these are things that you do in the case of crisis, in the case of war, and it works. Does it work in the case of peace? Is this a realistic scenario for a peaceful post-war in Syria? Even in Bashar al-Assad's mind? Yes, in his mind, definitely. And this is his model of trying to control. Even look at what he's doing now to civil society. He left. He's done with pretty much the armed groups. He's done with the political structures, and now he's looking after civil society actors. And I'm not talking about civil society actors operating in opposition areas or in SDF areas. I'm talking about civil society actors operating in regime areas. There was whether we like it or not, whether Bashar al-Assad liked it or not, there was a space created from 2011 up until pretty much 2017, where some independent civil society actors emerged and started to take a role, whether in minimalistic service provision, but also in proper civil society work. And that space now is shrinking. It's being co-opted completely by the Syria Trust for Development or by the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, where they've become the two key entry points into operating in regime areas. Not only for Syrian actors, but even if you're an international NGO that wants to go and operate in Damascus today, you have these two doors to knock, and that's it. So this co-optation of society is kind of the model, and that at least we can read from the behavior of the regime. The way to try to create a resistance or try to create a pushback against this model is by continuing to invest in those smaller local structures and not leave the entire space open for the government in Damascus to completely co-opt. It's going to be a long way to get.
Absolutely. That's why I'm saying we're entering into a different phase of the conflict that might take 20, 30. It's a generational thing.
Ms. Ali Raja, I want to go back to you. You mentioned earlier that besides the two major parties, power sharing is going to involve in the coming period other factors, other players. Realistically, do you see that process happening? You mentioned women, you mentioned other actors.
In the national dialogue period, yes, we did see the involvement of women, youth, and civil society. And the whole idea of the national dialogue was to reach a consensus for a constitution Yani, constitution was a manifestation of power sharing. It would say exactly how we would share our power. That's number one. Number two, it was shedding light on how the federal system is going to be, and that's another way of sharing the power, which is very critical in the history of Yemen. And traditionally, or in the past of Yemen, of course, it was more a federal state, because during the Himyarite and during the older stages, but later on it wasn't. So you came to the stage where you have a weak central government that's trying to rule and govern, and they have problems of governing. Any form of either power sharing or even dictatorship, if they don't know how to rule and give benefits to the people that they want, definitely the whole idea would go back again to how do we reform the system so that we can improve the whole idea of benefits to the people, either economically, socially, and politically. Through the constitution, as I said, that would be the only way that we can put it as a reference point that the Yemenis can really look up and try to work on. But again, when you come back to your question was, are we able really to have that power sharing at this level, at this stage in the Yemeni conflict that we're having? It's very critical because you have two powers or two parties that are fighting. And ironically speaking, the legitimate government is outside Yemen. It's very unusual. Usually you have the government on the ground, then you have the rebellions outside. Now, in the Yemeni case, no, we have the government outside, and the rebellions are on the ground in the capital. So, very ironical, the one stage. Another stage is that it's true that the Houthis are not dominating the whole region of Yemen or the whole country of Yemen. They're only dominating probably 25% of the geography, but it's the most populated. It's the 25% of geography, and at the same time it has maybe the 85 or the 75% of population. So again, the power of the people lies there, and they're influencing that. The government the government party is ruling, of course, the less population, and it's outside Yemen. At the same time, they have this problem is that even amongst those who are with the legitimate government, they are not sharing their power. So again, there's another dilemma that they're going through. When we come to the peace talks, as I said, in peace talks, to stop the war, they don't want the other parties to be part of this negotiations, like the women, the youth, and the civil society, but they want the two parties. They don't even want the Southerners, which is the ST group, which is, again, the Southerners is a new movement that took place in Yemen, and they were thought that after the unification of Yemen, that their power has been taken, and they were not given, they were not shared. So it's in Yemeni situation, it's becoming more even complicated. And it's not, the longer we stay in this position, it's getting more complicated. But at another level, people and communities and local communities are working their way. It's amazing, and how the small communities are sharing power and sharing their wealth in a very intricate way, away from the government, away from the central powers, and they're trying to work their way out in a model that's different from the model that's taking place on a higher level. So I think it is very important in the peace talks that we engage a little bit, understand how the community works and sharing their power and sharing their wealth at the local level, and then try to link the two on the different levels.
I have a question here before we move to questions, and I want to ask this to all three panelists. External powers in all cases play a very important role in terms of timing and in terms of conditions. Has the moment of external consensus been reached in the case of Yemen, you think, and is that going to make a difference?
As my colleague said in Syria, he was talking about maybe there should be a power sharing at a different level. It's true. Whatever is happening at the international regional level is affecting it's going vice versa, and I think that's the dilemma that Yemen is going through. And without really sorting that out between Kingdom Saudi Arabia and Iran, in our case, it's going to escalate. It's not going to help. Even our relations, the Houthis' relation with Hezbollah is closer, of course, to Iran, and they're taking the model of Hezbollah mostly. But they're not taking what Joseph was said, is that they're trying to open up. They believe that they cannot rule unless they open up. Not yet. They haven't reached that level. And they're more like Khomeini started in Iran, when they were very rigid and when they were still very closed. And that worries us a lot, because we don't have the luxury of time for them to wait until to include other groups or other political parties or others, Muslims, Muslim groups, part of in the power sharing. I think we are taking maybe the Lebanese model in a sense that is not even. If Joseph said that it's the best of the failing, we are taking the failing part. And the other sense that we still do have that, we're not failing. We failed as a state, but we did not fail, and that intrigues me really. We failed as a state, but we did not fail as a community, in the sense of we still have groups functioning at the socioeconomic and political levels locally. And that needs a lot of attention, a lot of understanding for us really to think about. So I would stop here and hopefully...
It's really very interesting.
Yes, thank you.
But before I go back, Joseph, the war has ended like 30 years ago, and it seems at many different points, external intervention is still important for the Lebanese system to function. Is that okay in the sense of...
It's never okay. No. I mean...
Is that part of the equation of a system that works with some failure?
No, first of all, I'll answer your question, but just I think there's a very interesting remark from what has just been said. I mean, you have cases, especially in this region, I mean, in the Middle East, where I think you have to look at the dynamics between, of the relation between state and society. We often tend to think that the Arab state as a model is a strong state. In fact, it's not a strong state. It's a fierce state. It's a brutal state, but it's not strong in the sense of national integration, and let's say it's strong in terms of coercion, in terms of superimposition of norms and rules. And when, in fact, it fractures, it completely collapses. And this is a very interesting case of, I think, of many countries in the region where society is stronger than the state. Now, this is a curse, because sometimes primordial ties are stronger than anything else, but at the same time, it's a safety net of countries where the state is no more able to provide security. And this was the case of Lebanon. So society continued to function. I mean, at least you and me are Lebanese. For example, I'm born and raised during the war. And I think that part of our survival was due to the strengths of society at a time where the state was completely in oblivion. So this is a very important parameter to keep in mind. Which countries have a strong state, which countries have a fierce state, and which countries have a balance between society and state, which is also interesting. Because we also always tend to think in this part of the world that the state is something given from somewhere. You buy a state from the IMF or something. The state is a social contract, is the product of a social contract. So it is the product of interactions that happen in society. It's not something that you buy. It's not a BOT agreement. This is the first point. The second point, and this
but in these two cases, the strong society is not developing political parties, opposition that could power share. Like, this is at the heart of the failure of there's no power sharing. There's no infrastructure for the strong political society to actually play a role.
You're getting me back to the discussion that we had before. Power sharing between whom and whom?
State and
between
society.
State and society, between segments of society, between regional powers, between both. And this leads me to the answer to your question. I think the three cases that we have here on the panel, I mean Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, are cases where you will have to have, and Lebanon had it, but you will have to have a power sharing between segments of society that will produce a certain social political contract, i.e. the state. And then you will have a power sharing between regional powers in the sense of a kind of a Yalta agreement regionally that will ensure the framework for peace. In Yemen, it will be probably Saudi, Emirati, Iranian, maybe a little bit Qatari. In Syria, it will be Russian, Iranian, Turkish, probably at some point Jordanian and Israeli, blessed by the US and etc. In Lebanon, the Taif agreement was very specifically a point of juncture between the US, Syria, the Vatican, and Europe that agreed that the war has to stop, and then it was crafted and brewed in a Lebanese way. This is not always the case. Take, for example, Tunisia after the revolution. It's a power sharing. What happened in Tunisia, not the revolution, not the ousting of Ben Ali, but the crafting of the historic compromise that happened 2 years after the revolution is a national pact. It's a kind of power sharing agreement without regional powers. It's between the labor unions, the patronat, I mean the businessman, the Women's Association, and the Human Rights League, and the Islamists. So if Al-Nahda and Nida Tunis haven't agreed on power sharing and about limiting their appetite to power, to which they were entitled by the balance of power. Each one of them could have had an appetite to take the entirety of power, which was the case of the Islamists in Egypt, for example, and they avoided this mistake. This is a case of power sharing where you don't have a regional intervention and neither an international blessing. So it was the wisdom, or call it as you wish, of the Tunisians themselves that succeeded to do that. However, and this leads me to what I haven't said in my first intervention, this has to do with each country's regional environment. You have countries that have a regional environment that is not amenable to something completely endogenous. Because it's the country is porous, the country is in a very specific place. Probably Tunisia was blessed of not being neither on the line of the Saudi-Iranian rivalry nor on the Arab-Israeli conflict rivalry. So it was far away and it could have been done. Other places are, location, like Donald Trump says, because we have to quote Donald Trump somewhere, location is everything. So I think it has to do with also the regional environment. But to come back to the basic question, I think that and this is something maybe you alluded to, having people voting and using ballot box doesn't mean power sharing. This is democracy. It happens in many countries. Power sharing is something else. It's a way of distributing representation through democracy, spoils in the good and bad sense of the term, and guarantees in the sense of group guarantees that are not exactly the same as individual guarantees. And this is the difficulty of power sharing. And this is why I come back to what I was saying. The time and political culture is something very important in order to produce power sharing. Because if you don't have the political culture, and political culture is something that comes from tradition, from ideology, from behavior, from practice, and etc. Not every society is, and this is what you said, is mature at that time to power share. And unfortunately, in order to accept sometimes power sharing, you have to reach a certain pain level in a conflict that leads you to accept power sharing, because it's not always pleasant to share power or wealth or anything else. So the pain level has to reach a certain point. This is probably the case in Yemen. It hasn't yet reached the level where everybody will say, okay, fine, I can't take the maximum, I'll accept something else. In Syria, the regime was strong enough because of its regional and international backers to avoid the pain level. But at one point, if you come back to 2013, 2014, we could have thought that the regime would accept a power sharing formula. However, the balance of power changed things, and it avoided it.
I'll take it back to you with this last question before I open the floor. You mentioned that the process could take 20, 30 years before it's ready for this formula. Do you see Syria outside the international scene, outside even playing a role as the Syria that we know for that long? And would the external powers who are now involved be okay with such a long-term strategy?
I think the Syria we know pre-2011 is gone, and it's gone for a while. And it will take time before Syria can take back whatever role it had, whether in the Arab world or beyond. And the only place where Syria will continue to try to play a role is Lebanon. And it will not try to play it directly like it used to play it before. It will play it through Hezbollah. And there is a point now, there is a question now that is asked, who's stronger? Is it Syria or is it Hezbollah? Who's dictating what? On whom? That's a very big question. But just to give an example of how independent Syria is at the moment, look at the Constitutional Committee and how it's being constructed. You have 3 international powers that are nominating Syrians to this Constitutional Committee. Russia is nominating the representatives of the Syrian government. Turkey is nominating the representative of the Syrian opposition, and we have the United Nations nominating the third list, the middle third. And you have the Turks and Russians battling over the middle third and trying to put vetoes. Syrians have nothing to do with this. We're being selected by international powers to draft our own constitution, right? I mean, this is the level of international intervention within the Syrian conflict today.
That's one form of power sharing.
It is a form of power sharing among internationals.
Yeah.
How does it reflect on Syrian society? Minimally. And that's the big issue. As long as we don't, so 2 things. We need to bring back Syrian agency into Syria. And second, really focus at that local level and what can be brought out of it. Because if we're going to continue to look at this only as an international conflict, which very much it is at the moment, we're going to have to, and I don't want to be very, how do I say that? I don't want to be very directive, but we're going to have one of 2 models, either North Korea or Iraq post-1991. Mm-hmm. And yes, the world can tolerate a Syria that is a pariah state because it has tolerated Saddam Hussein in power from 1991 to 2003. So we have previous examples that tell us that yes, it can exist.
Okay.
Or Sudan today.
Or Sudan with Ammar Bashir.
I want to open the floor if there's any questions.
Thank you. This was an extremely interesting discussion, but and it leads to some very fundamental question, and it seems to me one of what we are dealing with when we are dealing with Syria, when we are dealing with Yemen. We could throw Libya into the hopper, although it's not part of the discussion. We are dealing with failed states. And at this point, and what is at stake, and I'll take Joseph Bahout commented that Lebanon is the most successful of the failed states, whether the effort at finding a political solutions for these countries is not a different concept of the state rather than jiggling around with the political system. And I think you have all touched on it. You have to start with the local communities. You have to start at the local level and so on. And this is a big challenge, both in terms of the countries that are intervening or the institutions that are intervening, that are working with a very conventional concept of the state. And and also in part of the domestic actors, and whether the situation is not getting worse because of this concept of the state. That is, the state is centralized. Joseph called it a Jacobean state. I would call it a Weberian state. I come from a different educational background, but it's the same idea, the state that's all dominating. And certainly it's not the case in Lebanon. And whether that's what we should think about in terms of other countries.
Joseph?
Yes, thank you, Marina. As always, your remarks are very challenging and conceptually challenging. I don't know if we can embark everybody in this kind of discussion. I get 2 points from what you said. First of all, I think that this has to do with this dynamics between society and state, and who is stronger and who is producing what, and etc., which is part of the discussion. The second one leads me, I'm sorry to be a little bit, to add a conceptual layer to what you said. You said that you would use Weberian state, I'm using Jacobine state. Let me add to it without being too pedantic, but I think that we have to start, at least in political science, to look beyond the Westphalian model of state. I mean, the nation state, the Westphalian nation state model is something that is probably reaching its end today, not only in this region. It is reaching it because of regionalism elsewhere. It is reaching it because of populism here and there, and I mean the new trend in the US and in Central Europe and etc. And it has reached it in the Middle East because the Westphalian state in the Middle East has shown that in fact it's a monster. In fact, it's a monster state. The centralized state in Syria, Iraq, or Nasserist Egypt, or even today with Sisi's Egypt, is a monster state. The other pattern of state is a kind of Lebanese tribalism. And so probably you have to look for something new, a new political engineering that we don't have an answer to. And I mean, if you and me were younger, we would be happy to have a career looking for something new. But unfortunately, we're almost retired. But so I think that we have to start thinking about new formulas of the state that are not forcibly Westphalian or Weberian or etc. I tend to think, and probably many people who worked on consociational democracy would tend to think that something like the power sharing formula like Lebanon, Belgium, Nigeria, etc., could be functional, but however, there are a lot of caveats that lead it not to function. So it leads us to, yes, an impasse or a stalemate. I agree with you that we are on a stalemate. I don't have an answer, but I think that we, at least in our lenses, in our paradigm, we have to start maybe getting out of this Westphalian, let's say, jail that we are into. I'm not sure I answered you, but I tried.
Yeah, thank you. I have 2 questions, one to Jamila. I wonder whether the hope that we can have for Yemen is linked to the fact that, regardless of the fact that it's a failed state in one way or another, but there are two aspects. One is we have local peacemaking, for instance, by women initiatives in Thais, if I'm not totally mistaken. And the second, even more important in my view, is that regardless of the war, the Yemenis have never stopped talking to each other, and there has always been a form of ability to dialogue with each other. So I think there's still some hope in all the mess that we are seeing. The second would go to Assaad, and I would like to provoke you in a way. I wonder whether the whole system of Assad being the military winner is only working and functioning because the refugees and the internally displaced people are not coming back. If they would all come back, and it seems they are not welcome to come back, the whole system would, and the whole balance of power would be different.
Thank you for thank you for that question, because it seems to be my concern lately. Of course, there would be hope if, only if, only if the UN puts attention into the local tools for mediation and reconciliation. I feel still that there is a gap between the local and the national, and that makes me a little bit tiresome. It's about time that we understand the dynamics of peacemaking and peace resolution at the local level. And this has worked for a period of time, but is it applicable now, especially if we talk about the regional factors that are involved? We had a traditional of what you call, you don't go into bloodshed. In the Yemeni history and the tribal system, you don't go, you have steps to go. And after you even have bloodshed, you have other ways of resolution to keep the peace in the community. But now with the interference of the regional factors, it's different. As everybody knows, of course, that we have now Ansar Allah or the Houthis, now with Shia, Qasr Shia, we have Ikhwan Muslimin, which are supported by Qatar to some extent. We have Salafism, which is supported by or empowered by both Emirates probably and Saudi Arabia. So now we have this new effects that are coming, and they are creating a confusion among the tribal system or the community system that the Yemenis have. And I think people in our community and the tribal system could not digest that yet, but with what now is motivating everybody, and that's the sad part about it, is we're a poor country and we're becoming the scarcity of food and accessibility to food is the driver. So now I want money. It's not now, we're not thinking in the sense of a state and peace and no. Now I'm being paid to fight. To survive for livelihood, now I am being paid. And definitely there are some peace agents that are trying to find a way to go back to the system we had and to link it with the national system. And as you said, and there's some women who are trying to work on peace. There are other groups that are trying to work on peace, but still, it's not enough. And we'll have to work on that more. Thank you.
Well, I definitely agree that Damascus doesn't want the return of refugees. At least the behavior that they've had for a while, the different laws that have been issued over the past 2 years indicate a strong unwillingness from Damascus to receive refugees. And there are several reasons, although I'm not sure that a full refugee return or a significant refugee return will tip any balance in the Syrian conflict at the moment. And I'm going to try to say why. Although most of the refugees, at least in the beginning of the refugee movement in 2011, 2012, up until pretty much half of 2013, most of the refugees were from rebel-held areas or areas that were more pro-opposition than pro-regime. But ever since middle 2013 until today, most of the refugee movement comes from government areas. And there are people fleeing, mainly men of military service age, fleeing the military service and not willing to go and basically participate or be part of the war. They're not necessarily oppositionists per se. They might even be loyalists, but they just don't want to participate in the war effort. So looking at the refugee community, at the 6 million or 7 million as a homogeneous body would be, in my opinion, erroneous. They're as diverse as the Syrian society is, and they include all kind of wakes of life in terms of affiliation, etc. Just look at the Syrians in Germany, for example. You have everything in Germany. You have from the most extremist oppositionists to the most harsh, staunch loyalists in different parts of Germany, and even in Turkey, which generally was supposedly attracted only pro-opposition refugees. You do have strong regime loyalists present there who fled to Turkey mainly for business reasons. So a lot of the big businessmen, for example, in Turkey are coming from Damascus or from Aleppo, and they still go back to Damascus and Aleppo and have their businesses. So their reason to come to Turkey was more for economical reasons than anything else, or to establish a bigger market, etc., etc., etc. So a return of refugees will not necessarily tip the balance. However, what will be interesting to see is whether the government in Damascus will allow for a return of IDPs. And that's a different story. So far, they haven't at all. If we look at a place like Daria, which was a center of the rebellion and of the uprising against the regime, people have not been allowed back yet. Even the people who are still in regime areas. Now, I'm not talking about people in Idlib or in other non-government held areas, but even people in government areas are not allowed, or from that area are not allowed to go back to their properties. The same case applies to Eastern Ghouta. Eastern Ghouta was a besieged area for 4 or 5 years. The regime took it over completely and continued to impose a quasi-siege on the area. People in Eastern Ghouta are not allowed to go out. They need a permit. They need a security permit from Amn al-Dawla, from the security apparatus. And people who live in Damascus are not allowed in. They're allowed in on an exceptional basis to go inspect their properties, but they're required to go out by 6 p.m. So there's strong policy, at least at the moment, from the government not to allow people to go back to these different areas that were the centers of rebellion, mainly around the capital. Things in Daraa are very different, and that's why we can't talk about a government or a national level policy. It's a very regional policy that the regime is adopting at the moment. In Daraa, things are different for many reasons. First, not a lot of people have left Daraa. It's not like what happened in Eastern Ghouta or in Daraa or even in Eastern Aleppo. And second, the Russian role is much more important in the Daraa deal than it was in the Eastern Ghouta deal and the Daraa deal. So we have to look at these different reconciliation agreements, so-called reconciliation agreements, at a very, unfortunately, at a very agreement by agreement level, because they dictate different realities on these areas. But overall, just to summarize the refugee issue, given how much of the social fabric has been destroyed, and given how fatigued Syrians are, not only inside Syria, but even outside Syria, I don't really see a significant refugee return tipping the balance anytime soon. It will create opportunities for the future, for sure. But at the moment, I don't think it will change or it will tip the balance.
I think we have time for another question before, okay.
مرحبا. أيوة. عمار الأشوال صحفي يمني.
Good morning, Ammar Washfi, a Yemeni journalist. Please speak up. Just to be clear, we have to talk about the main problem, which is between Syria and Iran. And in order for the problem to be settled in Iran, the international community and the UN have to control these two countries. One that's supporting the Houthi, and the other is supporting the legitimate government, and both are proxies, and this is why we need that the international community and the UN make pressure over these two countries, because the Yemenis don't have much leverage in everything going on.
Okay. What we did, we would try to explore, we put some ideas and we tried to explore that there are different levels of mediation that for Yemen to succeed, It has to be taken into consideration. And one of these was, of course, as you kindly said, that there should be a dialogue between Saudi Arabia and Iran. But now, with the coming of the American new administration and Trump, it makes it more difficult and difficult. Of course, we could have solved a lot of problems out, not only the Yemeni-Saudi and Yemeni issue, but a lot of issues in the region if we did. We could have solved the problems of refugees. We could have solved the issue of extremism if there was a closer dialogue between Saudi Arabia and Iran. But unfortunately, things are moving the opposite, and directions of the international politics are igniting the whole animosity between the countries, because there's a lot of benefits from the animosity of Iran and Saudi. There's a lot of benefits. Why would I lose those interests and benefits? So I agree with you, the Yemeni people are suffering because of that, but at a different level. We are stuck there, but should we be stuck at the Yemeni level because of that? Or could we come up with a Yemeni formula that would help us solve the problem, at least stop the war and have the flow of goods and trade come into Yemen to revive the Yemeni people? I agree with you.
I have a question also to Ms. Jamila. Since the speakers are with Arab nationalities, allow me to speak with my native language, Arabic. بدي أسألك عم تقولي عم.
Allow me to ask you the following. You're saying that to a certain extent the Hezbollah model is being implemented in Yemen through the Houthis, and this is somewhat what I've understood from your intervention. But we cannot, I think, make a comparison between the model of Hezbollah in Lebanon with that of the Houthis in Yemen, because for Hezbollah, the main battle is against Israel that's wanting to occupy Lebanon. And we know, and we've agreed on this in Lebanon, that Hezbollah is an enemy and an occupying state, whereas Hezbollah, throughout the different ministerial statements, has enjoyed a certain level of legitimacy as a Lebanese movement of government, or of resistance, and this is something that the Houthis in Yemen do not have. In addition to the fact that the Houthis are in a state of war with another Arab Muslim state. We know that the war is not going to lead to any place. Both are Arab and Muslim countries, and there are a lot of commonalities between both peoples, which is different in the situation of Hezbollah and Hezbollah. Perhaps the solution is to deal with the concerns that Saudi Arabia has about the Houthis, and between brackets the Shiites, and preoccupations about potential control by the Shiites over the kingdom. And the Houthis, on the other hand, have aspirations in order to participate in the governance structure, in order to perhaps get over this and help out the Yemeni people that's suffering a lot from this. And we see the humanitarian disaster that has been swiping through the country. Perhaps the only solution is to open up a table of negotiation or discussion through the TAF, or like the TAF Accords, and to include in this dialogue guarantees that would deal with the preoccupations of both parties until a solid solution can be found. Thank you for your time.
About comparing Houthi and Ansar Allah to Hezbollah, there is a resemblance, and they're trying to. They are trying, of course, to take the model that you have. And I said, and I even explained that it's true that they're trying to take that model, but still they don't have the experience of Hezbollah. They don't. I'm not talking about goals, okay? Who's the enemy, etc. Of course, you can explain it however you want, but of course they do have common goals in the end. Israel, America, Israel, America, they do have that, okay? Regardless of how they deal with it, both of them. But again, for the Houthis, if they are trying to imitate Hezbollah, I wish they do imitate it in a better way. not in the rigidness that they have. And for the Houthis, to me, personally, I believe the Houthis are closer to Saudis than they are to Iran, personally. If we solve the problem between the two, between the Houthis and KSA, because they live in the borders and they did have historically a lot of interaction. The royal family of the Imamate period is in Saudi Arabia. That's number one. Number two, most of the trade comes from the areas because they have the same line borders. They share the same line. Some of the tribes are shared between the two countries. There's a lot of issues that really make the Saudis and the Houthis come closer, I believe. So if we do have a really wise approach, and I think it would come in one stage, and it happened in Bahrain 1 when there was a dialogue between the Saudis and the Houthis, and it did not materialize into something successful. At that stage, for different reasons, I think maybe if we had Bahrain 2 or Bahrain 3 that can talk about this relation between the Saudis, it would diffuse a lot of what's happening. That's number one. Number two, we all tend to talk about how Iran is supporting the Houthis, but on a logistical basis, it's not that much. It comes from otherwise. There is a world some weapon trade happening in Yemen. Doesn't necessarily have to come from one area. It's a business that's working. So let us look at it this way: is that the Houthis are trying to take the model of Hezbollah, number one. Number two, I think that they're closer to Saudi Arabia than they think, or other things. But there has to be some kind of dialogue that we have to work on it and to be approached. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I can't take more questions. I'm going to close and ask my guests to just give me the closing remarks with one note of optimism. Transitional justice, in most cases, is important before any serious power sharing formula. Joseph, I want to start with you. We haven't had in the case of Lebanon. And after that, if you see that this happening anytime soon, and whether this would be, and I ask you to be brief, please.
Very, very briefly, I fear that the Lebanese model or the Lebanese history is exactly the contrary. It's not at all a case of transitional justice, because the exit of the war in Lebanon was based on the amnesty law and amnesty also, regarding history. So I think that this is a counter model. Did it work or not? I leave it to people to judge. But this was a way of exiting the war at low cost, because if not, probably the war would have been prolonged for a while. Now, what would have been the outcome? I don't know, but this is what has happened. I think in cases like Syria and etc., the question is very different, because again, this is a case of, in Lebanon, it's society versus society. It's not state versus society. In Syria, it is a brutal state versus a martyrized society. So probably that transitional justice has a place there. So
Assaad,
I think
do you want to close with any thoughts?
Well, I'm surprised that Joe is a bit optimistic on that one.
I haven't said optimism.
Obviously, if we're going to talk theoretically, we're never going to be able to get sustainable peace in Syria without some form of accountability. The levels of crimes that were committed in Syria, whether the use of chemical weapons, whether the use of barrel bombs, the indiscriminate shelling, but not only that, you have as well what Daesh has committed in terms of horrific crimes, the mass graves that are being discovered at the moment in Baghouz, but not only in Baghouz, in Raqqa and elsewhere. So you have crimes committed at such a scale that without some form of accountability, it will be very hard to imagine how you can go back to a form of societal peace. Now, how realistic is that? At the moment, it's completely unrealistic. But, let's not forget, it took 30 to 40 years to bring Pinochet to account. So I think the accountability process should continue. I believe the universal jurisdiction is giving us a way or some form for victims to feel that there is some form of accountability coming. It was very interesting to see, for example, the German police issue a red notice on Jamil Hassan and asking the Lebanese authorities to hand him to Germany. That's a good sign that the accountability mechanisms within national jurisdictions are helping at least to provide some hope for accountability. Is this the accountability that the Syrians are looking for? Absolutely not. But it at least provides a mechanism for some reparations.
Jamila, would you like to close?
Very quickly, for us, transitional justice at this stage is like a luxury. We came to stop the war at a certain period because of reconciliation, okay, where President Saleh was given immunity, and most of his people were given immunity, so there is no thinking of going to transitional justice, but there's a lot of thought in the idea of documenting the cases, and that's very important for transitional justice. Reparation, because people need that at some stage, but going to court and punishing those who violated the rights and stopping the repetition of these violations, I think that would have to be delayed in the Yemeni case. So we don't have courts, first, that would function well to do that job. Number two, we cannot pinpoint the people now because they're part of the ruling parties that are trying to create peace. So I think that we will have to stop at some stage, not exceeding the, as I said in the beginning, that you have to document, you have to reparation, and try to establish the courts that are going to do the job. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, the audience.